I never should have played it. I should have known better than to trust an unknown game from an anonymous fan. But I was desperate. My channel had been lagging, the views were down, and I was on the lookout for something, anything, that could reignite the excitement I once had for my content. And then, I received the message. Simple, almost too straightforward, but it caught my eye. You need to try this. It's like nothing you've ever played. I promise you'll love it. The message came with a download link to an obscure game titled Grim Reach. No reviews, no previews, just an unlisted game with a cryptic, almost unsettling vibe to it. Normally, I would have dismissed it, but something about it felt different. So, against my better judgment, I decided to stream it. The moment I launched the game, I felt it, something was off. The graphics were dark and grainy, yet strangely lifelike. The title screen flickered, almost as though the game was trying to pull me in before I even started. It was set in an abandoned house, one that felt too familiar. A creaky wooden floor, cracked wallpaper, and dim lighting that seemed to smother the room in a suffocating gloom. At first, it felt like any other indie horror game, eerie, unsettling, but not outside the realm of what I had encountered countless times before. But as I started to explore, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain, a photograph hanging on the wall. It wasn't just any photo, it was a picture of me from my childhood, the exact same one I had tucked away in an old album. I froze. How could this be in the game? I leaned closer to the screen, my heart racing. The photo, however, was only the beginning. As I moved through the house, the game began to shift, morphing into something far darker, far more personal. The first hint of something wrong came when I heard a voice, a whisper, so faint that it almost seemed like it was coming from behind me. "Do you remember her?" it asked, the words slithering into my ears. At first, I thought it was just part of the game's sound design. But as I continued, the voice grew more specific, more insistent. It called my name. "Mark, you remember, don't you? The necklace. Find it." My blood ran cold. The voice, it was my mother's. The game had somehow tapped into a memory so old, so buried, that I hadn't thought about it in years. My mother, who had passed away when I was just a teenager. She used to wear this delicate silver necklace, one that she always told me was a family heirloom. But I hadn't thought about that necklace in forever. How could the game know about it? The chills that crawled up my spine were like ice, but I convinced myself it was just a well-crafted script, a clever detail designed to immerse me in the game. But the game wasn't done with me yet. As I explored further, I noticed something even more disturbing. The game seemed to react to my movements in real time. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the in-game character would mirror the exact motion. When I stopped to read a note on the wall, the character in the game would pause and glance at the same spot. I tried to brush it off, maybe it was just a fluke in the coding. But when I noticed something shift in my peripheral vision, my heart skipped a beat. I glanced toward the edge of my screen, and I swear, for just a moment, I saw something, no, someone, standing behind me in the reflection of my monitor. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The silence pressed in on me like a weight, and I began to feel it. The game wasn't just reacting to me, it knew me. It was watching me, studying me, and slowly, the line between the virtual world and my own reality started to blur. And then, the game asked, in that same whisper, "Are you alone?" That's when I realized, this wasn't just a game. This was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that knew too much. I didn't want to keep playing. I didn't. Every instinct I had screamed at me to quit, to turn off the game, to unplug my computer, and run as far away as possible from whatever this thing was. But I couldn't stop. My fingers were frozen over the keyboard, a strange, magnetic pull keeping me locked in place. It was like the game had dug into my thoughts, into the deepest corners of my memories, and was holding me hostage there. The line between my reality and the game's world had blurred. And the worst part was, the longer I played, the more real it all felt. It was as if the game wasn't just some collection of pixels and code anymore, it had become an entity, an unholy force that had wrapped itself around my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But I wasn't alone. No, I wasn't alone at all. The game had become me. I thought I had seen everything the game could throw at me, the picture of my childhood, the whispers of my mother, the way it mirrored my movements. But it wasn't over. Not even close. It was like the game had been waiting for me to slip up, to show it something deeper, something darker. That's when the walls of the game began to close in on me. I had just entered a new room when I noticed something strange. The air in the game was suddenly thick, heavier, almost suffocating. The dim light of the room flickered as if it were struggling to stay on. I brushed it off as a glitch, a weird visual effect, but then I heard it, a soft sound, like breathing, not from the speakers, but from behind me. At first, I thought it was just my paranoia. But then the breathing grew louder, ragged, like something was standing right behind me. I snapped my head around. Nothing. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone in my own room. I decided to press on, thinking maybe I was just losing my mind. But as I continued exploring, something else started happening. The game wasn't just mimicking my actions, it was now responding to my thoughts. I know how that sounds. It doesn't make sense. But I swear, as I approached a new area in the game, I felt this horrible, gnawing fear inside of me. The game's text box appeared on screen, flashing with a single sentence, "I know what you're afraid of." My heart dropped. I hadn't said a word. I hadn't typed anything. But the game knew. I stared at the screen, my eyes wide, refusing to blink, as the game's camera zoomed in on a dark corner of the room, revealing a shadow, something tall, thin, and so impossibly wrong that my breath caught in my throat. It was standing there, motionless, just like the things you see in your nightmares, the ones you can never remember clearly, yet their presence lingers long after you wake up. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. Waiting. But I didn't have the courage to look away. I couldn't. I clicked on the corner of the screen, forcing myself to walk closer. And as I did, the game's whisper grew louder, clearer. "You remember me, don't you?" I froze. This wasn't the game talking anymore. This wasn't some scripted line. It felt real. My fingers shook on the mouse as I tried to turn off the game, but the options menu was gone. The screen flickered, my computer stuttered as if it were trying to catch up to something behind the code. A low, guttural growl emanated from the speakers, like an animal just out of sight, hungry and waiting. Then, out of the silence, a single word appeared in the game, "Run." I should have shut down the computer then. I should have thrown it out the window, destroyed it, whatever it took to escape this nightmare. But, against every ounce of reason and sanity in me, I clicked continue. I had to know what would happen. I had to understand how this game had reached into my life so deeply, so personally. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. The room around me, the very room I was sitting in, suddenly appeared on the screen, perfectly mirrored. Everything was the same, down to the smallest detail. But in the reflection of my monitor, something was different. I wasn't alone anymore. Standing behind me, just like in the game, was something that wasn't supposed to be there. And it was moving. The thing in the reflection, it wasn't me. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't just some trick of the light or a hallucination. It was wrong. It stood there in the reflection of the game, its limbs too long, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying me. I could feel its eyes on me, a weight pressing against my chest, suffocating the air around me. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was as if the entire world had frozen, leaving me alone with the growing, gnawing presence in the corner of my room, now reflected in the game. The worst part was that it wasn't just watching me, it was getting closer. Slowly. Stealthily. I glanced back at my screen. The shadow in the game was still moving toward me, just like the one in the corner of my room. But this time, the game wasn't mimicking my movements. It was anticipating them. As I shifted my gaze from the screen to the room behind me, the shadow in the game mirrored my movement immediately. My fingers, trembling, reached for the mouse, but it felt like they were moving through molasses. The connection between my body and my mind, it felt wrong, like it wasn't me controlling anything anymore. I had never felt so disconnected from myself. The shadow in the game crept forward with unnerving speed, and the game's eerie whispers began again, each word punctuated with a terrible, guttural tone that didn't belong to anything human. "I'm closer than you think." And then, without warning, the lights in my room flickered. A sharp, buzzing sound pierced the silence, and I felt the temperature drop several degrees. I whipped my head around, expecting to see a broken light bulb or some electrical failure. But that wasn't what I saw. In the reflection, the shadow was now directly behind me. I froze, my pulse hammering in my throat, my mind racing. I turned to face it, my eyes darting wildly, but the room was empty. The shadow was still in the game, but not in reality. It was here, in the game world, and that was far worse than anything I could imagine. I tried to stand, to run, but the words on my screen froze me in place, all of them flashing in unison, "Look behind you." The blood drained from my face. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. There was no way something could be standing right behind me, watching me, breathing in the cold, stale air of my apartment. But the overwhelming dread clawing at my throat was too real to deny. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see it. But the game knew, it knew I was scared, and it wanted me to look. It wanted to break me, piece by piece. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to look down at my hands, to steady my breath, but when I opened them again, the game's screen had changed. The camera angle had shifted, now showing an overhead view of my entire apartment. And that shadow, it was there, in the corner of the room, just like before. But this time, it was moving. Slowly, it crept closer to my desk, to the very spot I was sitting in, and I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. It was coming for me. I had to act fast. My brain screamed for me to shut the computer off, to do anything to stop this nightmare from continuing. I lunged for the power button, but when I touched it, the entire system froze. The screen turned pitch black. For a moment, everything was still, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. But the game wasn't finished with me. The screen blinked back to life. This time, it wasn't the game that was showing. It was a video, a live video feed of my apartment. I could see the familiar corners of my room, my desk, my bed. But there was something else on the screen. A shadowy figure, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at grotesque angles, loomed behind me. It was real. It wasn't in the game anymore. It was in my world. And it wasn't just standing behind me. It was reaching toward me. Its long fingers brushed the edge of my shoulder, cold and clammy, and I felt it, I felt it. That was the moment I realized. The game hadn't just been watching me. It had been controlling me. I could feel the air growing heavier, thick with tension, as the game on my screen flickered again, and for the first time, I saw the truth. The game wasn't just a game. It wasn't some viral phenomenon or a quirky little horror experience. It was alive. And it had been alive all along. The eerie whispers that once sounded like glitches now formed words, whispers that knew my name. "I'm coming for you," it hissed in a voice that chilled me to my very core. I was no longer just a player, I was the prey. The screen grew brighter, the figures on the display taking on an even more sinister form. The shadow behind me, the one that had been tormenting me since the game started, moved in tandem with the horrifying images on the screen. It was no longer just watching me, it was mimicking my movements. I could feel my skin crawling as the game twisted and shifted before my eyes. It had become a nightmare I could not escape, a nightmare with no end. I tried to disconnect, to pull the plug, but the wires wouldn't budge. The more I struggled, the more I realized, the game controlled everything. My hands were frozen in place, no longer obeying my will, my thoughts blurred by a rising wave of panic. Each second felt like an eternity, each breath a battle as the cold fingers of dread wrapped tighter and tighter around my throat. I heard the faintest whisper again, and this time, it wasn't just the game. The shadow, the figure behind me, was speaking. I don't know how, but it had found its voice. The same voice from the game. The voice that felt like it was coming from all around me, creeping into my thoughts and twisting my very sanity. "You can't leave," it rasped. "You're already mine." The terror that gripped me was overwhelming, but there was something even more unsettling than that. The shadow behind me, it wasn't just an image on the screen anymore. It was real. It was in my room, right there, its presence growing undeniable as it stretched towards me. My breath hitched as I felt a cold hand brush against my neck, icy and suffocating. My mind screamed for me to move, to get away, but my body betrayed me. I could no longer move. I could only feel it. Its fingers, cold and relentless, slid down my spine, sending waves of agony through my nerves. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but I was trapped, a prisoner to whatever dark force had hijacked my life. And as I stood frozen, I felt something new. The game was no longer just an external terror, it was inside me. I could feel it deep within my chest, in my heart, in my soul, as if it had woven itself into the very fibers of my being. It was alive, and it had claimed me. Suddenly, the room began to warp and distort, the walls stretching and bending as if reality itself was unraveling. I tried to fight back, to tear my eyes away from the screen, but it was useless. The game had won. I was part of it now, a mere pawn in a game that had never been meant to end. The shadow had become my reflection, and I had become the thing that haunted my nightmares. And that, my friends, is where this story ends, if it can ever truly end. Because the game is still out there, waiting for its next victim, watching, reaching. And I am trapped. You see, the scariest part is not what happened to me, but the knowledge that you, too, could be next. You could pick up that game, that cursed, innocent-looking game, and it will find you. The question is, will you make it out? Or will you, like me, become a player in the game of terror with no escape? I tried to escape. Believe me, I tried with everything in me, but the more I ran, the tighter its grip became. The game, that damned game, had taken everything from me, my sanity, my home, and now, it was going to take my life. The terrifying thing, though, was that I wasn't alone in this twisted reality anymore. There were others. I could feel their presence, their souls trapped just like mine. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, a victim of the terror that had consumed me, but no. It was real. The other players, those whose names I never knew, whose faces I never saw, they were here too. Their cold, lifeless eyes stared at me from the walls, the reflections, even the screen itself. It was as if they were trapped in the very fabric of this nightmare. And as they gazed at me, their expressions twisted into silent screams, as if begging for release. But the worst part was the whispers. They were not just words. They were memories. My memories. Their voices echoed in my head, every moment of my life replaying in fragments, growing more distorted with each passing second. The game had not just taken my body, it had stolen my past. My identity. I didn't know how much time had passed. Days? Hours? I couldn't even tell anymore. Time had become as fractured as the reality I now existed in. But the game, it kept going. And with each level, each new twist, it forced me deeper into the abyss. I felt like I was losing myself, my mind slipping further away, until the game began to show me something I wasn't prepared for, the truth. The screen flickered, and there, in the most haunting of ways, a new image appeared. It wasn't a new level. It wasn't a new challenge. It was me. My reflection. But not the one I knew. This version of me was pale, hollow-eyed, twisted into something grotesque. It was as though the game had reshaped me into something monstrous. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't just playing the game anymore. I was becoming it. The game had fused with me, and as it continued to twist my reality, it began to rewrite my very soul. The walls, once so solid, began to pulse. They throbbed with a life of their own. I could hear the sounds of other souls, somehow, faintly, just beyond my grasp. Screams filled the air, but they were muffled as if trapped behind thick glass. The game, it seemed, was trying to break through, to take me with it into the depths of whatever realm it came from. I wasn't in control anymore. The screen before me, the reflection of myself on it, it wasn't a mirror anymore. It was an opening. A portal. A doorway into a world that I was never meant to witness. And as I reached out, unknowingly, to touch it, I felt a hand, cold and slick as though it had been dipped in ice water, grip mine. It wasn't mine. It wasn't human. It was the hand of something older. Something more powerful than anything I could comprehend. The game was alive, not just in the pixels, but in the very air. The hand pulled me forward, dragging me closer to the screen, to the place where reality no longer mattered. I knew, at that moment, that I had no choice but to follow it, to step into the unknown, because once you're part of the game, there's no turning back. I never thought I'd come to this. I thought the worst had already happened, that the game had shown me all its twisted tricks, but I was wrong. So incredibly wrong. The screen in front of me pulsated like a beating heart, its dark glow now a part of my soul, entwined with my every thought. When I reached out, drawn by the unseen force, my fingers brushed against the glass surface, and in that instant, I felt a shock, a searing cold that shot up my spine, paralyzing me for just a moment. And then it happened. The world around me shifted, or perhaps it didn't shift at all. Perhaps it had been this way all along. The room dissolved, the walls disintegrating into nothingness as if they were being erased by the very hand of the game itself. What replaced it was not a familiar reality, not the one I'd known before, but something far darker, unfathomable. The air smelled of decay, thick and rancid, like the breath of the grave, and the shadows moved of their own accord, stretching and twisting as though alive. I felt it before I saw it, something ancient, something so deeply embedded in the fabric of this world that I could barely comprehend its presence. But it was there, in the corners of my vision, flickering in and out of existence. I caught glimpses of it, a figure, tall and indistinct, its outline blurred by the fog that clung to this new reality. Its form was shifting, as though it could never settle into a single shape. One moment, it had the grotesque features of a man, the next, it was a twisted creature, like something from the deepest nightmares of forgotten folklore. And it was watching me. I felt its eyes on me, even when they weren't there, and I could hear its voice, soft, sibilant whispers, creeping into my mind like a disease, infecting my every thought. You should have never played the game, it whispered, over and over again, a constant refrain that echoed in my head, growing louder with each passing second. But it wasn't just the creature that haunted me. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything around me began to twist and warp, as though this place was held together by the thinnest of threads, ready to tear apart at any moment. I felt the ground tremble beneath me, and when I looked down, I could see it, the cracks. They spread from my feet, spiraling outward like veins through the very earth, each one pulsing with a dark energy that made my heart race. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped within this nightmare, unable to flee. And then I saw it, the screen, still glowing in front of me, now covered in what looked like bloodstains, the crimson hue of the digital display making the symbols and numbers appear more sinister. The game had changed. It had become real, and I was no longer a player. I was part of it, a cog in a machine that had no purpose other than to devour everything it touched. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You're here now," it said, the voice sounding like 100 different people, all speaking in unison. "And you'll never leave. You belong to us." In that moment, a deep, primal fear took root in me. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, constricted, unable to produce sound. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Every inch of me was suffocating under the weight of this new world, this nightmare that was now my reality. The game had been a trap from the beginning, and I had played right into its hands. But what terrified me the most wasn't the game itself. No, it was the fact that I was beginning to understand it, to see the pattern behind the madness. This was not just some sick, twisted entertainment for whoever, or whatever, created it. This was a prison. And I had been chosen as one of its inhabitants, a soul to be consumed and twisted into something else, something new. But the worst part, the part that I couldn't shake from my mind, was the realization that the game had always known what it was doing. It wasn't just trapping me, it was changing me, piece by piece, until I was no longer me. There is no escaping it now. No matter how hard I try, no matter how much I scream in my mind, the game has already claimed me, and it will not let go. I wish I could tell you that what's happening is some sort of sick hallucination, that the fever of fear I'm living through is just a bad dream. But I can't. It's too real, too undeniable. The walls around me have ceased to exist. I am no longer in the room, no longer even in the world I once knew. I am drifting in something far darker, a void between dimensions, where the boundaries of reality are warped beyond recognition. And everywhere I look, the game is watching me, waiting for my every move, feeding off my terror. It thrives on it. My fear is its power. As I wander through this place, if you can even call it that, I feel myself becoming something else. Twisted. Each step seems to stretch longer than the last, like I'm moving through thick, viscous air. My own body feels foreign, alien, as if it's no longer truly mine. I swear, at times, I can see my own reflection in the shadows, a distorted version of me, something inhuman, barely clinging to the remnants of who I used to be. I try to scream, to run, but my voice is swallowed by the silence that stretches around me. I can hear faint whispers, too faint to understand at first, but as I move closer, they become louder, more insistent. "You belong to us." The words slice through me like cold steel. There is no escape. I begin to realize the truth. This game, this nightmare, isn't just something that lives inside a screen. No, it's alive. It is a sentience that has fed on souls long before mine, feeding off their desperation, their fear, their every ounce of humanity. And now, it wants me. It's consumed me, just as it has countless others, and I can feel it inside me, eating away at my mind. It knows my thoughts before I even have them. It whispers my darkest secrets, the things I've tried to bury deep within myself, things I'd forgotten existed. I can hear its laughter now, soft and sinister, reverberating through my skull. It's mocking me, playing with me like a cat toying with a mouse. The terror I feel is raw, visceral, but somehow, it doesn't come from the fear of being trapped, it comes from the horrifying realization that I am becoming part of it. With each passing moment, I can feel myself slipping further, slipping away from everything that was once human. The world, my world, has become nothing more than a twisted, chaotic mess, a reflection of the game's dark and malevolent nature. The air grows heavier, thick with the weight of unseen eyes watching from the depths. I am not alone here. I don't know how many others have fallen victim to this thing, but I can feel their presence, too, as if their souls are trapped in the same nightmare, each one a silent witness to the madness that is unfolding. I can hear their voices, faint and disembodied, crying out for help, pleading for mercy. But there is no mercy in this place. There is no escape. The game has already made its final move, and there is no turning back now. This is it. This is where it all ends. Or rather, where it all begins, for me and for everyone who dares to play. I am lost. There is no return. There is no one to save me. Only the game, its endless, insatiable hunger. And the worst part? The part that gnaws at the edges of my sanity. I know that soon, very soon, I will no longer even remember that I was once me. I will be swallowed whole by this darkness, this thing that calls itself a game, and my soul will be nothing more than another cog in its ever-turning machine. It's happening. I am becoming part of it. And in the end, when I am nothing but a shadow of my former self, I will be waiting for the next one. The next victim to fall into its trap. And they'll be just like me, fighting, screaming, begging for freedom they'll never find. Just another name in a game that never ends. I never imagined that it would end like this. The walls around me, once so comforting, have dissolved into darkness, and now I am alone, utterly alone in this wretched void, where not even the faintest glimmer of light can pierce through the suffocating blackness. The game has become my reality, my world, and I no longer know where the game ends and I begin. There are no faces here, no bodies to scream for help, just endless, swirling shadows that feel alive, like they're waiting for the moment when I finally break. And believe me, the breaking is coming. I can feel it in my bones. The more I struggle, the closer it gets. The closer I get to becoming something else, something that belongs to this nightmare, to this game. At times, I even wonder if I ever really existed in the first place or if this is all just a perverse creation of the game itself, an illusion, an impossible loop designed to torment me forever. I try to remember the world I came from, the people I loved, but all of it is slipping away. Their faces blur, their voices fade like an old memory, and soon, they'll be nothing more than a whisper in the storm of madness. There's a voice now, echoing in my mind, a voice that isn't my own, a voice that whispers promises of release. At first, I believed it, but now I know, now I understand, the release is just another lie, another twisted game to pull me deeper into its grasp. It speaks to me like an old friend, caressing my broken psyche with words of comfort, claiming that everything will be okay if I just let go. But I know better now. Letting go is exactly what it wants. If I give in, if I allow myself to drown in this darkness, it will be over, not just for me, but for everyone. It will have won, and I will never be free. I try to fight it, but the more I resist, the more the world around me distorts. The shadows twist and writhe, alive with hunger. Something monstrous stirs in the depths of this endless night, something I cannot see but can feel, its presence, its breath, creeping closer. It knows me, knows everything about me, and it wants something far worse than my fear. It wants my soul, my very essence. It wants to consume me, to make me a part of this eternal nightmare. I am no longer sure whether it is the game controlling me, or if I've become part of the game itself. There are moments when I catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure, human, standing just beyond my sight. It's a distorted shape, a warped reflection of someone I once knew, but when I reach out, it vanishes into the darkness like smoke. I'm losing myself. Slowly, surely, I'm fading into nothing, into another piece of the game's puzzle. And then, the final revelation strikes. The truth I've been avoiding crashes into me with the force of 1,000 storms. The game, this thing, this entity, has always been here. It has been a part of everything, feeding on human fear for centuries, millennia. It never needed a screen to exist. The screen was just a window, a door to open, a lure to draw in the unsuspecting. I was never meant to escape. The game's true purpose isn't to trap the players, it's to create more players, to lure in souls, to feed off them, and to keep them trapped forever, becoming part of the eternal cycle. I thought it was just a game. I thought it was a thing of pixels and code, but I was wrong. It was never just a game. It was always a living force, manipulating everything, orchestrating this nightmare from the beginning. And now, it's too late for me. There's no way out. The cycle continues, and I am the next in line. I never thought it would come to this, that I would find myself at the precipice of insanity, teetering on the edge of a world so twisted, so utterly alien, that every shred of my reality would crumble away. The moments that followed the revelation were a blur, a slow-motion cascade of horrors that only seemed to accelerate as I plunged deeper into the depths of the game's grip. It wasn't just the isolation that tore at my mind, but the overwhelming sense of being watched, of being studied. The game, that cold, calculating thing, was no longer just a game, it was alive, pulsating with a malevolent hunger that could be felt in every beat of the silence around me. Every sound I heard seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were breathing with me, exhaling in the same rhythm, feeding off my fear. It was as though the game had become an extension of my thoughts, my fears, my every emotion, and it was now controlling the very fabric of my existence, warping it into something unrecognizable. I tried to fight it, tried to hold on to the fragments of who I was, but it felt like wading through a quagmire of my own mind, pulling me further and further into a place where logic had no bearing, where the laws of physics no longer applied. The world around me twisted with a sickening frequency, flashes of faces, distorted, mangled versions of people I once knew, ripped through the darkness like flashes of lightning. They would stare at me with wide, empty eyes, mouths stretched into grotesque smiles, their voices nothing more than hollow whispers, urging me to let go, to give in. But the worst part wasn't the faces, the whispers, or the distortion, it was the feeling of being constantly pursued, like something was always just behind me, watching, waiting, preparing to strike. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl, and I could feel it, it was closing in. Then, on what seemed like the last thread of my sanity, I heard the voice again, but this time, it wasn't just in my mind. It was real, a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the very air I breathed. The sound sent a chill crawling down my spine, and I froze, not daring to move. My eyes darted to the shadows, to the corners of the room, where the darkness seemed to pulse like a living thing. The game was no longer playing with me, it was hunting me. The boundaries between the digital and the real had shattered, leaving me trapped in a liminal space, caught between two worlds, neither of which offered any escape. I could feel my heart racing, my breath shallow, as the walls seemed to close in, the darkness growing ever thicker, swallowing everything in its path. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The game had found me, and it was ready to claim me as its own. But even as I felt the grip tightening, I couldn't help but wonder, was it the game that was hunting me, or had it, somewhere along the way, become something far worse? Had I become part of it? The room was colder than ever before, an oppressive chill that sank into my bones and twisted my thoughts. It felt as though I were no longer in control of my own body, as though something outside of me, something far more powerful and malevolent, was holding the strings. The shadows had grown thicker, darker, and they seemed to breathe with an unsettling life of their own. Every corner of the room was alive with movement, flickering lights that seemed to hide something just beyond my sight, and strange, echoing sounds that made the walls tremble. It was as if I had stepped into a nightmare from which there was no waking. No escape. And yet, in the midst of this terror, there was a pull, a force that drew me toward the center of the room, like a moth to a flame. I didn't want to go closer. I didn't want to face whatever horror lay there, hidden in the heart of the darkness. But I couldn't fight it. Every step I took seemed to drag me deeper into the grip of this nightmare. My feet moved of their own accord, a disobedient dance of terror, as if my body had long since surrendered to the power of the game. The voice, that terrible, guttural voice, whispered my name again, its sound like nails scraping against a chalkboard. It felt like a million cold fingers were closing around my throat, squeezing the air out of my lungs. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, louder than the whispers, louder than the eerie groans of the building, louder than the deafening silence that followed each gasp of breath. Then, I saw it. The screen. It was no longer a lifeless object, it pulsed with a sinister energy, an energy that seemed to hum with anticipation. The image on the screen flickered for a moment, distorting in a way that felt wrong. And then it appeared. My own face, twisted into a grotesque, mocking version of myself, stared back at me. But it wasn't me. The eyes were empty, hollow, and the smile stretched too wide, too unnaturally. It grinned, a cruel, devilish expression that sent a wave of pure terror crashing through my mind. I wanted to look away, to scream, to do anything but stand there and face it, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my body unable to move, my mind consumed by the horrifying image in front of me. The smile on the screen began to shift, the edges of the mouth pulling wider and wider until it was almost a grotesque rictus. And then the voice came again, louder now, mocking me in a way that twisted my very soul. You thought you could escape. The words slithered into my brain, cold and venomous. The walls around me seemed to close in, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the game had become me. It wasn't just a game anymore, it was a part of me, a dark force woven into the very fabric of my being. I could feel it pulsing through my veins, like venom, like poison. The room began to warp around me, furniture twisted and contorted, the walls bled into the floor, the air itself began to warp and distort. And then I understood. The game had never been a game. It was a prison. And I, foolishly, had locked myself inside it.